Hello and welcome to another lesson, this time in the engagement patterns section of the course and the barriers to participation. And I've broken this down into two parts, so this is part one. Just a reminder about the screencasts: the yellow text boxes are the tasks for students, the green text boxes are the note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are the differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are the teaching and learning strategies and ideas for the practitioners. So in regards to this topic, the syllabus basically requires you to know, to understand the barriers to participate in sport. So what are the key barriers that are preventing people and groups of people from participating in sport? And once you've done that, try to recognise the factors and how they impact the engagement patterns. How do they impact participation to the specific groups that you should have hopefully looked at in this topic already? So your first task, you can see on the right hand side, is once you've written the title, what prevents people from playing sport? Okay, so hopefully you've come up with a few ideas there in regards to that question. Obviously, a lot of you would have written down things like being injured, for example. Some of you may have mentioned there about the fact that you've got a disability that might impact on us playing a particular sport. Some of you may have gone a bit deeper and actually thought about maybe the impacts on different gender, whether it be men or women, for example, and then looking at other examples as well in terms of time restraints, so time limits that might prevent us from playing sport and so on. So let's look at the key barriers then in regards to this topic. So before we do that, first of all, let's just think about what we mean by a barrier. So the barrier to participate and to participation is an obstacle that prevents the group within society from participating in that sport. So it's anything that you can think of that is preventing us from actually participating in that sport in the first sense. So it's an obstacle that we have to overcome sometimes, or hopefully remove altogether, so that we've got a clearer path to participate. And ultimately, it says there, a barrier basically reduces the overall levels of participation. So when we look at the different groups, when we look at individuals, if that obstacle is there, it's stopping us from playing that particular sport. So that's why we need to try and remove that barrier. So if we look at the barriers to participate, they come in all types of range of sizes and issues in essence. And we can look at things like one barrier being attitude, attitudes that exist in society and for the individual itself. We can look at role models, or the lack of role models perhaps in a specific sport that might be a barrier to playing sport. The accessibility, so how available the particular facility or sport is. And also looking at media coverage. Media has a big impact in regards to whether participation is a barrier or not. And also looking at things like stereotypes and sexism, and how does that topic in particular provide an obstacle perhaps from playing a particular sport. And then even things like culture, religion, and also religious festivals. All of that can have an impact in terms of our background, of whether we are allowed to socialise and play in certain sports and so on. We've also got things like family commitments, and that links into the availability of leisure time perhaps. All of those have an impact in regards to whether we can play sport, and education does as well, interestingly, as we'll look at a little bit later in part two. Also things like disposable income, so how much money we actually have and maybe what socio-economic group we are part of. And finally, as you probably mentioned in your first slide answering that question, disability, injury, and this idea of inclusivity, which we're going to look at shortly. So again, pause the video here and think about, if we're looking at the group of women in particular, which of those that you've listed do you think is the biggest barrier to women in sport? Okay, so hopefully you come up with some ideas, and I think it's important, again, if you haven't done so, make sure you explain why. So if you need to pause your video again, make sure that you do. But some of you may have mentioned the lack of role models, for example, or even talked about the lack of media coverage in women's sport. Some of you may have talked about stereotypes or sexism, which occurs whether it be in school or whether it be in society in general. Okay, and that links, I suppose, into maybe what our attitude is as a woman perhaps, or even our feelings of what we think of in terms of women playing sport. Okay, so it's all about challenging those things today to ensure we remove those barriers. So if we look at the first one in terms of attitudes, we need to know what an attitude is. So basically, when we talk about an attitude, we're talking about the fact that an individual or a group has an opinion on something. And in essence, that means that people tend to respond in a certain way towards something based on their attitude. So our behaviour and how we respond is kind of modified, is kind of portrayed, should I say, due to the attitude that we might have, the opinion that we have. And ultimately, an attitude can come from all different forms of life. And ultimately, it might come from a role model, someone specific in the family, or friends in terms of peers that we hang out with. And ultimately, attitudes can be both positive and negative. So again, pause your video here and think about, what is your attitude towards physical education, for example? See if you can answer that question. And once you've answered that question, think about the second part of the question. Who has influenced your attitude in this? So I'm guessing the majority of you that are watching this will be taking GCSE PE, and if that's the case, then you'll probably have a positive attitude towards the subject because you've picked it, it's been one of your option choices, and you've decided to take that course because you're interested in it. And ultimately, you then need to think about what's influenced your attitude to have that positive attitude. Has it been from an inspiring PE teacher, for example? Has it been from someone in your family that's maybe pursued a career to do with PE or even taken PE themselves? Or it could be some of your friends, for example, that have taken PE and that influenced your decision and your attitude was positive because you're obviously involved and playing sport with your friends. If we move on in regards to attitude, obviously an attitude can be long lasting, but it can change over time. So we can influence someone's attitude. It takes a little bit longer rather than just it happening overnight, but ultimately we can change it over an extended period of time. So again, pause the video here. Can you think of a time when someone's changed your attitude to something? And then second of all, can you think how could we change someone's negative attitude in or towards PE? So ultimately, you'll have your own examples as to whether someone's been able to change your attitude towards something. And they may have been able to convince you, persuade you, for example. And in terms of PE, I suppose the challenge for teachers, practitioners like ourselves, ultimately, if we have an individual who has a negative attitude towards PE, we need to try and find a hook, something that's going to get them to enjoy it. And that could be either through participation, through coaching, through refereeing, and ultimately just trying to reward and praise where we can to change that negative attitude into a positive one. So when we think about changing attitudes and how we can do this, we can do it through a couple of means. One is by convincing and persuading others, and that can take time to change their attitude. Or ultimately, we can get the person to take part, to maybe see or feel the benefits and feel the positive impacts that it's having. And sport can do that, can't it? Through a kinesthetic, through us actually feeling the movement itself. So when we move on to attitudes and we're looking at the influence on women, then we can look at the fact that attitudes to participation can obviously change, okay? And in women, in the group of women in particular, in the last sort of 30 to 50 years, if we think about 50 years ago, there would have been a negative attitude towards women participating in sports. But that has changed over the period of time, and for the good, for the positive. We think of Sports Day in 2020, and we can see that there have been examples in the past of, for example, the London 2012 Games. We can see the impacts in terms of the football 2015 World Cup in regards to where England finished third and got a bronze medal. All of those has created obviously more of a positive outcome and a positive attitude towards women in sport. Again, pause your video here. Can you think of an example when your attitude has changed? Why has this happened? So similar to what you looked at in the last slide. And if we look at examples in terms of role models, we've got Dean Asher-Smith, for example, Helen Housby in terms of netball. We've got clear role models, Jessica Ennis, Hill in terms of athletics, of positive role models now that are really changing our attitudes towards women in sport and for the better, which is amazing. So let's move on to role models. Let's look at these two questions first of all. Pause video here. So who are the role models in your life? And second of all, how have they influenced you in sporting choices? So you may have mentioned obviously the fact that you might have had your parents or sibling, or it might have been another family member, a grandfather, for example, or it may have been an uncle or whatever else, who have influenced and have been a role model towards you. It might have been your peers, might be a celebrity. And they may have influenced your sporting choice as well, because obviously they may have played the particular sport, and that's obviously led you down that specific path as well. Other good examples, if we think of lockdown, when we had to stay indoors for an extended period of time, okay, people like Joe Wicks and other fitness kind of personal trainers and so on, okay, can provide that stimulation and that positive role model in being physically active. So ultimately, when we think of role models, we're talking about inspirational figures that people and groups of people look up to. And ultimately that, as I said before, can come from sports performers and personalities. It might come from family or peers. And ultimately, role models can have a huge influence in regards to our own attitudes and also our behaviour in regards to participation in sport. They can even have an influence in regards to things like fashion and lifestyle habits. And we only now have to think of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, in regards to the people that we follow and whether we copy some of those particular habits. And you can think back to yourself, you can reflect in regards to whether you do something because you've either seen a celebrity do it or an influencer do it, and so on. Let's look at the word accessibility. So when we talk about accessibility, we were thinking about how available the sport is to us. And ultimately, many sports require different types of facilities to participate in. And they might also require a specific location to take part in, and they might also require a specific type of equipment. So again, think about these next two questions. Pause your video here. Which sports are inaccessible? So which sports are difficult in terms of availability and therefore have participation which is lower, and which sports are the most accessible, and try to think about why. So try and give a couple of examples for both. Okay, so when we think about accessibility, things like water sports, if we think of skiing, for example, those kind of sports are quite inaccessible, especially within the UK. Ultimately, we've got 2 or 3 snow domes within the UK, but ultimately participation would be a bit lower because we don't have that geographical mountains and the landscape around us to help us with those snow sports. And the same in terms of water sports. If we live near a coast, then we're more likely to take part in things like windsurfing, surfing, canoeing, kayaking, and so on. Sports that are most accessible will be things that require little equipment. So football's a prime example. All we need is a couple of pairs of jumpers, for example, and they could be provided as goalposts, and we need a football and a bit of space, and ultimately there we go. We can play that particular sport. You could think of other sports that may be a bit more accessible as well. If we look at media coverage, media can have a positive and negative effect on participation. In regards to positives, it can create obviously role models, general interest, and good coverage will be all positive aspects. Whereas negative, we might be looking at the fact that we lack in the media coverage, we lack in the negative display of the particular sport itself. Again, pause your video here, see if you can answer this question. Which sports have been influenced in a positive way and in a negative way by the media in your opinion? Try to explain why. So obviously, if we look at women's football in particular, that's a real positive outcome in terms of media coverage in the last few years. I talked about 2015 World Cup, but even beyond that, 2019 World Cup, lots of examples in terms of the BBC covering that particular tournament. Minority sports, badminton is a prime example in terms of losing out. That's not getting the media coverage that it perhaps deserves, and that has an impact on those minority sports. And then finally, if we look at the impacts in regards to positive impacts and negative impacts of media. So in terms of positives, it raises maybe the attendance. Obviously, people want to go and see their specific best players and role models. The supporters become better informed. It creates obviously things like sponsorship, encourages participation. It develops sports personalities, and there's a better viewing experience for the actual spectator. Whereas the negatives, there are negatives to media coverage as well. Attendance can fall. More people might stay at home to watch rather than go to the particular stadium. There might be a minority sports which aren't shown. We talked about badminton. It might be other sports like rowing and so on. Sports players lose their privacy, and then we get events become sensationalised, so they just get overhyped by the media, and the media has the power to change the times, the fixture lists, and even change the rules. We'll pick up the next bit if you look at part 2 of barriers for participation.